Welcome, comrades and friends, to the reading theater. We're continuing on with our read here of Stalin, History and Critique of a Black Legend by Domenico Losurdo. And we are on Chapter 5, Erasure of History and Construction of Mythology. Stalin and Hitler as Twin Monsters. Cold War and Reductio ad Hitlerum of the New Enemy. With the outbreak of the Cold War, both antagonists seek to brand the other as the heir to the Third Reich that had just been overthrown by both parties. Nobody today, Lucas observed in 1954, will presume to claim that either the ideology or the procedures of Hitlerism belong entirely to past history. Unquote. Indeed, on this, the two sides seem to agree without difficulties. While the communist philosopher, using the category of imperialism, juxtaposes Truman and Hitler. On the opposing side, the category of totalitarianism is used to subsume under it both Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. Both categories are wielded as weapons of battle. The attempt to equate the new and the old enemy is not limited to denunciation of imperialism, i.e., totalitarianism. After describing as a process of destruction of reason, the ideological path leading to the triumph of the Third Reich, Lucas felt this need to subsume under the category of irrationalism also the ideology of the free world, quote unquote, led by the USA. The operation is not without difficulties. And there, the Hungarian philosopher looked to denounce the new form of irrationalism hidden under the shell of an apparent rationality. Yes, in the new situation that had arisen, it is perfectly natural for Marxist pragmatists rather than the German type of irrationalism to reign in philosophy, quote unquote, of which Wittgenstein, Carnap, and Dewey, among others, would have been its exponents. The difficulty of assimilating the new to the old enemy was also felt on the opposing side. In outlining the origins of totalitarianism, after having long insisted on the deadly role of imperialism and having singled out Lord Cromer in particular, who was still after the Second World War counted by Churchill among the heroes of the British Empire, Ardent completed the comparison and equated Stalin's Soviet Union with Nazi Germany by referring not only to totalitarianism, but also to another category, that of pan movements. And so there emerged another analogy. The pan Germanism of the second of the two countries compared would be matched by the pan Slavism of the first. This conclusion was the goal of a tour de force even more reckless than the one seen in Lucas. We will see Churchill comparing the communist movement to a church characterized by expansionist universalism and, quote, whose missionaries are in every country and in every people. In any case, the alleged Stalinist, pan-Sovietismists called on the peoples in the colonies to sweep away the domination of the master race, considered instead natural and beneficial by the pan-Germanism theorists. But at that point, in the two opposing camps, the main concern was the construction of analogies and symmetries. We look on with amusement when reading in Ardent that what characterizes the pan movements, and thus Nazism and communism, is an absolute claim to chosenness. Yet the celebration of the United States as God's chosen people runs deep through the American political tradition and continues to resonate to this day in the speeches of US presidents. Cold War prerogatives clearly took precedence over all other considerations. This is confirmed by the intervention in 1950 of a prominent American historian. At the time, he had opposed Franklin D. Roosevelt and his policy of alliance with the USSR. With the outbreak of the Cold War, he felt encouraged to restate the thesis of the political and moral equivalence of Hitler and Stalin. And in that he was engaged in the total identification of the two dictators. The former, Hitler, insists on the racial destiny of the Teutons, quote unquote. A common reader might be led to think of the manifest destiny and providential fate, which, according to a long tradition, would preside over the unstoppable expansion of the USA. But arguing and removing facts is a manner not unlike Ardent. The historian quoted here equated the Nazi motif of the racial destiny of the Teutons to the faith of Stalin and Lenin in the messianic role of the proletariat and the international revolutionary communist movement. To repeat, the celebration of the master race was central to Hitler's ideology. The search for analogies and precedents should point in the direction of the white supremacy regime long in force in the American South, to which Nazism repeatedly referred and which in some sense continued to exist in 1950, the year of publication of the book discussed here. Instead, the US historian discovers that an equivalence to Hitler's master race theory exists in Stalin's Soviet Union, where almost every important discovery is attributed to some unknown or little known Russian, quote unquote. The reductio ad Hitlerum of a former ally also entailed the accusation of genocide. The first to move in this direction was perhaps the front, hegemonized by the communist movement and the Soviet Union. In 1951, in New York, the black lawyer William Patterson, leader of the Civil Rights Congress, an organization engaged in the fight against McCarthyism on the one hand and the white supremacist regime on the other, edited a book that is at the same time an appeal to the UN to become aware of the tragedy that raged on in African Americans. In the US, particularly in the South, the regime of discrimination, humiliation, racial oppression, and social marginalization continue to operate. Rapes, lynchings, legal and extra-legal executions had not ceased. Police violence raged on. In 1963, Martin Luther King would still speak of the unspeakable horrors of police brutality. Outlining this long list of injustices and torments, referring to the convention approved by the UN in December 1948 against the crimes of genocide, and making use of the fact that, according to this convention, genocide does not necessarily entail the systematic annihilation of an entire ethnic group. The book bore a decidedly proactive title: We Charge Genocide. Apparently corroborated by the strong opposition encountered by this convention among U.S. politicians. The indictment was translated into many languages. In the USSR, the work appeared with an introduction by the Jewish intellectual Ilya Ehrenberg, who compared the Third Reich and the USA as both suffering from a genocide or potentially genocidal racist delusion. Of course, there were furious reactions to the book in the USA, and the accusation was reciprocated. A member of the committee calling for approval of the UN Convention declared, quote, "In communist countries, it is official policy to wipe out entire groups on the basis of their racial and national origin," unquote. If the beginnings of the Cold War saw each of the two antagonists branding each other with a new version of Nazism, and the crime of inviting the genocidal madness, as the triumph of the West progressed, the analogies game tended ever more exclusively in the direction favored by the victor. In particular, it has become an obsession in dominant ideology to equate Stalin and Hitler in the most complete way possible, to the point of presenting them as twin monsters. The negative cult of heroes. How was this achieved? While attention is focused exclusively on the Soviet Union and the Third Reich, Gandhi equated colonialist England and Hitler's Germany, British and Nazi imperialism, and attacked both in his condemnatory judgment. Scholars not suspected of anti-Westernism have repeatedly compared and even explicitly theorized the treatment of colonial populations by the liberal West to the genocidal practices of the Third Reich. This comparison has been applied to the deportation of the Cherokee people, ordered by Andrew Jackson, the President of the United States, the country visited and celebrated by Tocqueville, to the attitude taken by Theodore Roosevelt towards the quote-unquote inferior races, to be met with a war of extermination in the event of rebellion against the superior race, unquote. To the treatment inflicted by England on the Irish people, treated in the same way as indigenous people of the Americas, and still in the mid-19th century condemned to die en masse in starvation. There is more. The key terms nowadays used to describe the horrors of the 20th century already emerged from studies investigating the liberal world of the 19th century, with reference in particular to the, quote, development of industrial capitalism in England. It has been argued that the Gulag is not an invention of the 20th century. A totalitarian society was founded in Australia, as it swallowed up deportees from England, often wretches condemned for petty theft to which they had been driven by hunger. With regard to the tragedy of the indigenous populations in America, Australia, or the English colonies in general, authoritative scholars have spoken respectively of, quote, American Holocaust, i.e., the final solution of the Amerindian question, the Australian Holocaust, and late Victorian Holocausts, not to mention the Black Holocaust, the deportation and enslavement of survivors, 1 in 3 or 4, to which African Americans seek to draw attention. Finally, as we also seen, the Canadian Holocaust. Even when it comes to the events unfolding before our eyes, authoritative media outlets reported that in Afghanistan, a country under U.S. protectorate status, captured Taliban are massed in a place that resembles the Auschwitz Nazi concentration camp. And that in Guantanamo, a sort of modern day gulag is at work, according to Amnesty International's characterization. Finally, it is worth noting that the most unprejudiced American historiography has not hesitated to establish a comparison between Anglo-American annihilation from the era of entire cities, Dresden, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, on the one hand, and the genocide of Jews on the other. But all this vanishes, as if by magic, in dominant ideology and historiography, just as the reality of the concentration-era universe that in the course of the Second 30 Years' War emerged even in countries with a more consolidated liberal tradition, and, even after the defeat of the Third Reich, was kept up for some time as anti-Soviet and anti-communist measures, and that in any case were developed further in the colonies or semi-colonies. And yet, though colossal, this omission is not sufficient to create the twin monster myth. And here is how it proceeds further. From a comparison between the USSR and the Third Reich, we slide into the comparison between Stalin and Hitler. One and the other described by abstracting from their respective historical contexts and political projects. Once the explosive contradictions characterizing, on the one hand, the Second Time of Troubles, and on the other, the Second 30 Years' War, have been dispelled, Stalin's terror appears as the expression of gratuitous violence motivated exclusively by totalitarian ideology, or even by the bloody paranoia of a single personality. Similarly, Hitler's own historical context is suppressed. He was born at the end of the 19th century, the most painful century of human history, the century of colonies, and above all, the century of races. Has not yet ended and sweeps away once and for all the naive ideas of the 18th century with regard to the brotherhood of nations, and the mythology of the common origin and unity of the human race, the ideological paraphernalia to which the socialists pathetically cling, despite the resounding denials of history and science. In 1898, the Anglo-German author Houston S. Chamberlain, who would later become particularly dear to Hitler, but who at that time was acclaimed throughout the West, expressed himself in this way. That is to say, Even to understand Nazism, it is necessary in the first place to investigate the political project underlying it. And this political project not only does not refer back to a single criminal or mad personality, but beyond Germany and Nazism, calls into question in different ways other countries and other political movements. In this sense, whatever the judgment on the artistic level, Bertolt Brecht's The Resistible Rise of Arturo is not convincing. In order to illustrate Hitler's personality, Brecht employed a literary genre, the crime story, that is misleading. A presupposed moral was thus highlighted that is actually constructed as posteriori. Nazism has its roots in a historical period in which the evidence is constituted by, if anything, the hierarchization of races and a colonial expansionism based on genocidal practices. Of course, to inherit such a tradition at a time when it was beginning to be harshly contested, and to radicalize it to the point of wanting to implement it in Eastern Europe as well, is a horrid escalation. But it is an escalation, and not a phenomenon arriving ex nihilo. Widespread in the 19th century, culture was the idea of racial extermination, which Disraeli pointed out is an expression of an irresistible law of nature, quote unquote. At the end of the century, Spencer lamented, quote, "We have entered upon an era of social cannibalism, in which the strong nations are devouring the weaker ones," unquote. In the US at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries, there was no shortage of appeals to a final solution, and to a final and complete solution of the Indian question and the Black question, respectively. At the same time, in Canada too, an authoritative figure from the administration called for the final solution of our Indian problem, quote unquote. The horror and infamy of the escalation persisted, but it developed out of an experience of Germany's failure in building a colonial empire overseas. This project immediately swept away at the outbreak of the First World War by British naval superiority, which imposed on Germany a devastating and deadly naval blockade, even for the civilian population. And therefore they asked themselves, would Germany continue to be exposed to this terrible danger, or build a continental empire at any cost, resorting, yes, to massacres and genocidal practices, but to the detriment of inferior races, and in any case, by following the classic and established Western model of colonial expansionism? In dominant ideology, with all political projects vanished, Third Reich infamy is also configured as a manifestation of a mysterious, but nevertheless terrifying disease whose origin goes by the name of totalitarianism. The way is thus paved for equating Stalin to Hitler. Even the analogy between pan-Slavism and pan-Germanism, on which Arden insists, becomes unnecessary and perhaps cumbersome, and does not seem to enjoy particular success today. Everything revolves around two sick and criminal personalities, whose biographies are sometimes treated in joint fashion. What is most striking in these texts is the absence of history, and even, in a certain sense, politics. Colonialism, imperialism, the world wars, the struggles for national liberation, and the different and opposing political projects all disappear. Nor do they even ask about the relationship between the liberal West with fascism and Nazism, the former pretending to be the champions of the most authentic and significant ideas of the West, nor of its relationship with the old Russian regime, whose contradictions had been tending for a long time to precipitate into a huge catastrophe. All this is substantially overshadowed by the absolute centrality conferred to two creative, albeit wickedly creative, personalities. The theorem of elective affinities between Stalin and Hitler. It is said that these two personalities are not only politically and morally equivalent, but are also linked by a sort of mutual attraction. As proof of this, one refers to the German Soviet non aggression pact and of the delimitation of their respective spheres of influence. In fact, in one sense, this pact put an end to the Brest-Litovsk diktat. In another, it was only a stage in the contradictory process of delimitation of spheres of influence by the great powers that began in Munich and ended, provisionally, in Yalta. A few months after the conclusion of the Second World War, in 1946, Ernest Bevin, the leading Labour Party figure and British Foreign Secretary, saw the world as tending to be divided, quote, into spheres of influence, or what can be described as the three great Monroe Doctrines, unquote, claimed and asserted respectively by the USA, the USSR, and Great Britain. As the British Monroe rapidly crumbled, even in 1961, John F. Kennedy, fresh from the inglorious adventure of the Bay of Pigs, in the course of a conversation in Vienna, protested to Khrushchev about the results and the dynamism of the Cuban Revolution. The US could not tolerate a regime that would claim to undermine its hegemony in the Western Hemisphere, in one of their areas of vital interest, just as the USSR could not tolerate a slight to its hegemony in the security area in Eastern Europe. One might well consider it a particularly odious delimitation of the spheres of influence that took place on the basis of secret protocols of the German-Soviet Pact, and brand as cynicism the move that allowed Stalin to gain both time and space. But it is very difficult to reconcile such a condemnation with the thesis of mutual attraction between the two dictators, with the theorem of elective affinities. Indeed, soon after the outbreak of war by Nazi Germany, Churchill welcomed the entry of Soviet troops into eastern Poland. Shortly afterwards, in addressing the leaders of Latvia, Stalin gave a very clear explanation of the reasons for his policy in the Baltic countries. Quote, "The Germans might attack. For 6 years, German fascists and the communists cursed each other. Now, in spite of history, there has been an unexpected turn. But no one can rely upon it. We must be prepared in time. Others who were not prepared have paid for it." Unquote. It was only gradually, partly because of the need to foil the maneuvers carried out in the region by the Third Reich, that the military protectorate, with which Moscow initially seemed content, was transformed into a real annexation. The amputations suffered by Soviet Russia in the period of its greatest weakness were thus radically called into question, while at the same time the new ruling group's tendency to take on the legacy of the international policy of Tsarist Russia without excessive limitations was accentuated. In the usual assessment of the German-Soviet pact, the questions that would seem preliminary to its understanding are completely absent. What agreements had been previously stipulated by the Third Reich? How can one explain the outbreak of war between Germany and the Soviet Union less than 2 years later? And what were the plans cultivated by the number two in the Nazi regime, Rudolf Hess, who on the eve of Operation Barbarossa adventurously landed in England? In the race to reach a compromise or an agreement with the new regime installed in Berlin, Stalin arrived decidedly last. On 20th of July 1933, the Concordat between Germany and the Holy See guaranteed the fidelity of German Catholics to the new government established according to the Constitution, quote unquote. An acknowledgement that came shortly after the launching of exceptional laws, with recourse to terror and the emergence of the racial state, with the first measures against officials of the quote non-Aryan origin. 2 weeks earlier, the Catholic Zentrum dissolved itself, whose militants had pledged to provide positive collaboration to the National Front directed by the Reich Chancellor. Unquote. As for the Protestant world, it must not be forgotten that the Juche Christian started with the Hitler immediately after his coming to power, and took up that position by adapting Christianity to the needs of the Third Reich, reinterpreting the Protestant Reformation in a nationalistic and even racist key, in order to theorize a church fused with the German popular community, and founded on the reorganization of the diversity of people and races as an order willed by God. The Zionist movement also showed similar readiness to seek the favor of new rulers. The organ of the former, the Jüdische Rundstand, which remained substantially immune from the wave of prohibitions and persecutions that hit the German press immediately after the Reichstag fire. A few weeks later, on April 7, 1933, called Zionists and Nazis to be honest partners, quote unquote. It all culminates in the 1935 agreement to transfer 20,000 Jews to Palestine, authorized to take with them almost $30 million, with a strong impetus to colonization, to the process that would later lead to the formation of the State of Israel. Later, reacting to the transfer agreement, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem also tried to ingratiate himself with Hitler. Now, let us turn to the political parties aligned in opposition. Decidedly weak is the Social Democratic deputy Otto Well's speech on the occasion of the Reichstag session granting extraordinary powers to Hitler. It is primarily the Communist and Stalinist Party that was warning of the organization resistance against the barbarism now in power. The year 1935 was also when the naval agreement between Britain and the Third Reich was concluded. Intervening after the beginning of the feverish rearmament and the reintroduction in Germany of compulsory military service. It fed Hitler's hopes of being able to reach a strategic agreement with the recognition of the naval preeminence of Great Britain and the reciprocal respect of the two great Germanic empires, the British Overseas Empire and the German Continental Empire, to be built up with the colonization of Eastern Europe and the subjugation of the Slavs. It has rightly been described as a cynical attitude on the part of the London government, who gave the impression of endorsing an infamous program, already spelled out in clear letters in Mein Kampf. The growing concern in Moscow are unsurprising, along with the strong irritation of Paris, and the irrepressible joy of Hitler, who could thus celebrate what he defined as his happiest day. Even more disturbing is Poland's role. As has been observed, Poland became entirely subordinate to German policy, beginning with the signing of a 10-year non-aggression pact with Germany on 26th of January 1934. The following year, Polish Foreign Minister Beck declared to his deputy, quote, "There are two political formations, undoubtedly doomed to disappear, Austria and Czechoslovakia," unquote. The consonance with Hitler's program was clear, and it was not only a matter of words. The Polish ultimatum to Czechoslovakia, demanding the return of Tesin, finally convinced Beneš, according to his own account, to abandon any idea of resisting the Munich settlement. Poland had been seen so far a more useful jackal to Germany in the East than Italy had been in the Mediterranean, unquote. The Munich Conference did not mark the end of the Warsaw government's collaboration with the Third Reich. If Hitler was really aspiring to set foot in the Ukraine, he had to go through Poland. In the autumn of 1939, this seemed by no means a political fantasy. There even seems to be encouragement for this from Warsaw. In January of the following year, during a conversation with Hitler, Beck declared that Poland does not attach any significance to the so-called security system. Stalin had every reason to be concerned or distressed. Before the Munich Conference, the U.S. ambassador to France, William C. Bullitt, observed that the important thing was to isolate Asiatic despotism, saving European civilization from fratricidal war. After the triumph achieved by Hitler, a British diplomat noted in his diary, quote, "Czechoslovakia, from having been a dagger pointed to the heart of Germany, is now rapidly being organized as a dagger into Russian vitals," unquote. At the time of the crisis that resulted in the Munich Conference, the USSR had been the only country to call out the Third Reich and confirm its support for the government in Prague, putting more than 70 army divisions on a state of alert. Subsequently, after the complete dismemberment of Czechoslovakia by the Third Reich, in March 1939, Moscow forwarded a harsh note of protest to Berlin. The reaction of the other capitals was much more composed, quote unquote. And so, the Nazi fascist aggressors successfully devoured Ethiopia, Spain, Czechoslovakia, Albania, and China in Asia, thanks to the direct complicity or pacifity of the Western powers, who were inclined to direct the further ambitious and expansionist aims of the Third Reich toward the country that had emerged from the October Revolution. To the east, the Soviet Union felt the pressure exerted by Japan on those frontiers. The danger of invasion and war was thus arriving on two fronts. It was only at this point that Moscow began to move in the direction of the non-aggression pact with Germany, taking note of the failure of the Popular Front policy. Carried out by Stalin with conviction and decisiveness, the Popular Front policy had cost not a little. It had strengthened the Trotskyist opposition and agitation, especially in the colonies. What credibility could there be in an anti-colonialism that spared? So, the accusation sounded, the major colonial powers of the time, to concentrate fire on a country, Germany, which at Versailles had lost even the few colonies it had previously possessed. Above all, for colonial peoples themselves, it was difficult to accept the turn of events. England had been largely discredited. In the spring of 1919, it had not only been responsible for the Armistice massacre, which had cost the lives of hundreds of defenseless Indians, but had resorted to public floggings and dehumanizing collective punishment and terrible national and racial humiliation, forcing on city dwellers the humiliation of crawling on all fours to and from one's home, quote unquote. Later, as the Second World War flared up, the imperial government repressed pro-independence demonstrations by machine gunning them from above with the Air Force. These were the years when Gandhi stated that, quote, in India we have a Hitlerian government, albeit disguised in milder terms. And again, Hitler was Great Britain's sin. Hitler is only an answer to British imperialism, unquote. Indeed, when the war was over, Gandhi would go so far as to pay homage to Subhas Chandra Bose, who had fought alongside the Axis for the sake of independence. Subhas was a great patriot. He laid down his life for the country, unquote. In conclusion, it had not been easy for the USSR to get the idea accepted that, despite appearances, even for the people of the colonies, the main danger was still constituted by the Nazi-fascist coalition, by the Germany, Japan, Italy axis, and in particular by the Third Reich, which was determined to resume and radicalize the colonial tradition, even resorting to extreme means. For countries like England and France, the policy of the Popular Fronts entailed much lower costs, and yet they sabotaged it. At this point, the USSR had no choice but to pact with Germany, a move that has been defined as a last-minute dramatic improvisation, to which Moscow resorted in the absence of any other alternative, on the very eve of a new European war. This became a turning point that is usually assessed with an eye exclusively on Europe. but there is no reason to ignore the repercussions in Asia. Mao Zedong expressed his satisfaction thus, quote, "The pact represents a blow for Japan and a help for China, because it gives the Soviet Union a better chance of supporting China in her resistance to Japan." Unquote. Precisely for this reason, the Japanese government considered Berlin's behavior to be treacherous and inexcusable. In fact, flows of Russian arms and ammunition into China became very substantial. The attitude of the West was quite different. Quote, "It is still a dark page in the book of history that neither Europe nor America, on their own initiative and through comprehension of what was at stake, put the slightest obstacle in the way of the fascist rulers in Tokyo. And, what was worse, almost right up to the day of Pearl Harbor, the Americans were sending oil and motor fuel to Japan." Unquote. Let us now leave Asia aside to focus on Europe. The mutual dividends between the Soviet Union and the Third Reich, and the preparation of both for frontal confrontation, never dissipated, even during the months of the Non-Aggression Pact. Even before signing, speaking to the High Commissioner of the League of Nations in Danzig, Hitler made it clear, quote, "Everything I undertake is directed against Russia. If the West is too stupid and too blind to comprehend this, I will be forced to reach an understanding with the Russians, turn and strike the West, and then, after their defeat, turn back against the Soviet Union with all the forces united through me." Unquote. Judging from this excerpt, the Führer's constant goal was the construction of a German-led Western alliance for the destruction of the Soviet Union. If this alliance could not be stipulated by means of our prior agreement, then all that remained was to impose it on the reluctant patriot partners after defeating them. The transitional agreement with Moscow was merely a ploy to achieve victory and thus bring about the Western alliance necessary for the final showdown with Bolshevism. The Non-Aggression Pact was instrumental to the achievement of the main and permanent objective of the Third Reich, who unleashed Operation Barbarossa, presenting it as a crusade for Europe, to which European countries and peoples were called upon to contribute, and in fact did contribute, to varying degrees and with human or material resources. Was Stalin counting on an eternal or lengthy duration of the pact? In fact, from the very beginning, he was aware of the inevitability of confrontation with Nazi Germany. Quote, "We will be spared a war a little longer." Unquote. He took advantage of the time thus gained to consolidate his country's position. As early as November 1939, in Hitler's eyes, the communist ruled country appeared committed to military strengthening and was willing to comply with the pact only according to circumstances and convenience. It was a point reiterated by the Führer 2 months later. Stalin is cautious. He is well aware of the balance of power, but he is clearly looking forward to a difficult situation for Germany. He does not even lose track of the weather, either, and reveals himself to be more brazen than usual in the winter months, when he felt more sheltered from the formidable war machine of the Third Reich. The Führer's worries were anything but far-fetched. Let us take a look at Moscow's attitude at the end of summer of 1940. At a moment when, with the occupation of France triumphantly completed, the Third Reich seemed on the point of being able to force England as well to capitulate. Quote, while to Hitler, Stalin was expressing confidence in a rapid conclusion to the war, his diplomatic envoys and agents abroad encouraged every sign of resistance to the new order. The Moscow newspapers, which hitherto had only disparaging remarks for the Allies, began to report sympathetically the Battle of Britain and to call upon French patriots to resist the subjugation of their country. Even before this, the German Foreign Office had to protest against the anti-Nazi propaganda in which Madame Kollontai, the Soviet minister in Sweden, had indulged. Unquote. A conversation that took place in Moscow on the 25th of November 1940 between two of Stalin's close collaborators is revealing. Dimitrov. We are following a course of action to break up German occupation troops in various countries, and without shouting about it. We mean to intensify those operations further. Will that not interfere with Soviet policy? Molotov. That is of course what we must do. We would not be communists if we were not following such a course. Only it must be done quietly. Unquote. Stalin, clearly committed to encouraging resistance against Third Reich expansionism, also agreed with this line. Of course, there was a collision course, and Stalin was aware of this, as evident from the remarks he made and the orders he issued. On November 7, 1940, he stated that it was necessary to be the military equal of our enemies, and such to us all capitalist states, even those presenting themselves as friends. On November 25th of the same year, he stated, our relations with Germany are polite on the surface, but there is serious friction between us. In the early months of 1941, even the semblance began to fade. Quote, now resistance against Hitler was, from Moscow, being encouraged everywhere and openly. Unquote. This was particularly true of the Balkans, where the conflict of interest became increasingly acute between the two signatories of the non-aggression pact 2 years earlier. Stalin received the Yugoslav ambassador in Moscow, in the Kremlin, and discussed and defined with him the line to be taken against the policy of the Third Reich. Pleasantly surprised by this boldness towards the would-be masters of the world, the Belgrade representative formulated a question. Quote, what if the Germans, irritated, were to turn against you? The ready answer was clear. Let them come, Stalin said. The stipulation of the Friendship Pact between the USSR and Yugoslavia on April 4, 1941, was immediately followed by the invasion of Yugoslavia by Hitler's army. A few days later, reporting what was also the opinion of the Soviet leader, Dimitrov noted in his diary, April 18, 1941, quote, the war of the Greek and Yugoslav people against imperialist aggression is a just war. About this, there are no doubts. Unquote. The clash with the Third Reich loomed ever more clearly on the horizon. On May 5, 1941, Stalin observed, quote, is the German army invincible? No, it is not invincible. Now, Germany is continuing the war under the banner of conquest and subjugation of other peoples, under the banner of hegemony. That is a great disadvantage for the German army. Unquote. If the rapprochement between the Third Reich and the Soviet Union had caused considerable unease among the Nazi rank and file, and in particular Rosenberg, I have the feeling that this Moscow Pact will at some time or other exact vengeance upon National Socialism. Unquote. Operation Barbarossa aroused a feeling of relief. The strain on our honor is erased, Goebbels noted in his diary. The Führer himself wrote to Mussolini, I feel at peace with myself. The anguish and the feeling of disavowal of my origins, of my thinking, and of the commitments I had undertaken. Unquote. The feelings that had accompanied the non-aggression pact had vanished. Hitler commentated, a contemporary historian. Hitler, commented a contemporary historian, finally arrived at the confrontation that for almost 2 decades had been a central element of his thinking, and even of his psyche. Always longed for, the annihilation of Eastern and Asiatic Bolshevism would have made it possible to achieve, under the conditions imposed by Berlin, a recomposition of the unity of the West and the white race, and in particular a permanent agreement with the British Empire, which for the Führer continued to be the model of domination and exploitation. Unquote. It is only a gift to Cold War ideology when Arden asserted that Hitler had, quote, never intended to defend the West against Bolshevism, unquote. And that, on the contrary, he had remained ready to ally himself to Stalin to destroy it, unquote. In fact, the leaders of the Third Reich were not wrong in feeling relieved that finally, with Operation Barbarossa, they could confront and liquidate it, so they hoped, the real antagonist, the enemy of all time. Even before Nazism had come to power, on January 12, 1931, Stalin had branded anti Semitism as a kind of cannibalism. At the advent of the Third Reich, he had reacted on January 26, 1934, with a harsh stance against fascism, and against the fascism of the German type in particular. Again, as in 1914, the parties of warmongering imperialism, the parties of war and of revenge, unquote. The new war that was on the horizon promised to be particularly barbaric. It was the war organized by a superior race, say the German race, against an inferior race, primarily the Slavs, unquote. Stalin had then reiterated this notion on November 25, 1936, at the time of the presentation of the new Soviet Constitution, which he contrasted, because of its profoundly internationalist character, with the bourgeois constitutions, which tacitly assume that nations and races cannot have equal rights. It is true that, in that instance, that speech was of a general nature, as emerged from references made to the colonies and to discrimination based on the difference in skin color. But it is clear that the main target was Nazi Germany, which had raised racial ideology to the status of state doctrine. It was no coincidence that Stalin insisted on the principle of equality between nations, irrespective of their strength or weakness. At that time, it was the Third Reich that was the champion of social Darwinism at the international level. Still, within months of the outbreak of war in Europe, on March 10, 1939, in warning the Western powers that their, quote, great and dangerous political game of channeling towards the East against the Soviet Union, the Third Reich's expansionist policies would end in serious failure, unquote. I.e., with a non-aggression pact between Moscow and Berlin. Stalin had appealed for an end to appeasement, to the policy of making concession after concession to the aggressors, and instead to form a common front against war provocateurs. Completely removing the historical framework sketched here, Ardent enunciated a theorem of elective affinities between Stalin and Hitler. The only man the former was ultimately fond of was the latter, and the only man admired by the latter was the former. After what we have seen, to speak of fondness between the two sounds unintentionally humorous. While Ardent's thesis of Stalin's deliberate pro-Hitler policy is a trivial nod to Cold War ideology. In the Moscow of 1937, Feuchtwanger observes, everyone takes account of the future war with absolute certainty, and sees the German fascist as the enemy. The reason was clear. Our very existence, say the Soviet people, is so evident a refutation of all fascist theories that the fascist states, if they themselves would survive, must destroy us. Unquote. The war of annihilation that would later be unleashed by the Third Reich was foreseen then with precision, and far from slowing down, preparations for it would further intensify until they became frenzied in the months of the non-aggression pact. It is true, however, that starting with Operation Barbarossa, Hitler sometimes highlighted the political and military capabilities of his great antagonist. Would this be a confirmation of the theorem of elective affinities? During the Tehran Conference, polemicizing amicably with Franklin D. Roosevelt, inclined to read Hitler in a psychopathological key, Stalin stressed instead that the common enemy was very able, and that this was the only way to explain the extraordinary successes he had initially achieved. Is this a new confirmation of the thesis that has become commonplace? In reality, the Soviet leader was right, not the American president. One must have a very primitive vision of antagonism to think that, to be authentic, it must entail the misrecognition of the enemy's capabilities. While historians today agree in approaching the Führer's underestimation of the USSR, Ardent instead starts from his belated and partial regrets to construct a theorem of elective affinities. Hitler is, moreover, quoted one-sidedly. It is well understandable his aspiration to explain the unexpected setbacks or failures on the Eastern Front, which inflicted a stinging rebuttal to the myth of the invincibility of the Third Reich and the Wehrmacht by the out-of-the-ordinary characteristics of the new enemy. But such characteristics were by no means always defined in flattering terms. As early as 14th of July 1941, commenting on the fierce resistance encountered on Operation Barbarossa, the Führer declared, quote, "Our enemies are no longer human beings, but beasts." And echoing the views of his leader, one of his secretaries wrote to a friend, quote, "It can be said to be a fight against wild animals." These beasts and wild animals clearly included Stalin, who on another occasion was seen by Hitler as being coming from an underworld, confirming the satanic character of Bolshevism. On the opposite side, we shall see that, both before and during the war, Stalin branded Hitler as the champion of anti-Semitic cannibalism, or cannibalistic politics, based on racial hatred. It should be added that other leading political personalities of the liberal West, including Churchill, expressed sympathy for the Soviet leader. Franklin D. Roosevelt, when he spoke of the wonderful progress made by the Russian people, paid indirect homage to their leader. Finally, today, eminent historians emphasize the extraordinary military and political capabilities of Stalin, without underestimating those of Hitler. Should we include all these diverse personalities in the elective affinities theorem? In reality, in expressing this theorem, Ardent and those who follow in her footsteps slip from the plane of historical and philosophical research into one of literary Latanism. Latantism? Of literary dilettantism. There we go. That brings us to the end of the first part of chapter 5. When we continue on with chapter 5, we'll be reading this part, starting with this part, the Ukrainian Holocaust as an equivalent of the Jewish Holocaust. This is going to be answering some important questions and then contrasting that with, of course, the liberal famines and Holocaust that went on. Thank you, comrades, friends, and viewers on YouTube. If you haven't already checked me out on Kick, I stream every single day, starting around noon to 1 Eastern Standard Time. Come check us out. Come hang out with the gang over here on the Craxus Society on Kick. But thank you for watching. Give the video a like. All those things. Share it with your friends. Love you, comrades.